Thank you all for joining us at this Education Writers Association webinar. It's called Covering the Education of English Learners Amid Federal Policy Shifts. Hopefully you are in the right place today. My name is Tara Garcia Matthewson. I'm currently a Spencer Fellow at Columbia University, where I'm working on a book about bilingual education. Couple things before we begin. So this is recorded. Questions need to go in the Q&A box. Please include your name and affiliation with your question, and I'll read that out when I read your question so everybody know where this is coming from. One note on terminology. So the federal government refers to students who haven't mastered English yet as English learners. It's jargon I would encourage you not to use in stories that you're writing, but we will use it today. It is convenient shorthand. Some states call English learners emergent bilinguals. There are other names for them, but the idea is they have certain rights at the federal level that we're going to be talking about today. So here on the panel with me, we have Montserrat Garibay, former director of the Office of English Language Acquisition in the U.S. Department of Education during the Biden administration. We have Megan Hopkins, professor and chair of the Department of Education Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Ileana Najarro is a reporter at Education Week who has been extensively covering English learners. And I have already introduced myself. So we're going to get started with questions. Please remember, if any of our questions jog more questions for you, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A, and we will turn to those at about 1:45 Eastern time. So Megan, can you offer us some context about what has and hasn't changed when it comes to the obligations schools have to English learner students?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tara. Spoiler alert, summary, nothing has changed. But we have seen a lot of changes in the federal landscape. So obviously including reductions in force at the U.S. Department of Education, the movement of the Department of Education to labor. We've also seen an anti-immigrant and anti-multilingual stance being taken across the country and in the federal government with an executive order declaring English the national language. Nonetheless, what's important to remember is that all legal obligations remain under the Civil Rights Act, under the Equal Educational Opportunity Act, and both of those require that local and state educational agencies, so state departments of education and school districts, take appropriate action to overcome language barriers that may impede equal participation by students identified as English learners in the core instructional program. So to change any of that would require an act of Congress or the courts. We also know that subsequent case law and federal education policy, like the Every Student Succeeds Act, specify how English learner instructional programs should be implemented and assessed. So for example, by providing adequate resources and staffing, and by measuring student outcomes in states' accountability systems. So that's upheld by the Castañeda as well as federal education policy. And additionally, it's important to note that the rights of undocumented students, some of whom, but not all, of course, are English learners, have the right to a free public K-12 education, and that is codified in federal case law. So while the legal obligations have not changed, what has and may change is that there's less oversight of English learner programs from the federal level, particularly given reductions in force and overall changes at the Office for Civil Rights, where compliance and monitoring of complaints usually occurs. There's also quite a bit of uncertainty around funding, particularly for Title III, which I know we'll discuss later. So generally, we often think of federal policy as a system of carrots and sticks. So with changes to oversight, which might be the sticks that keep people from doing what they're supposed to be doing, and funding, the things that incentivize, the carrots that incentivize people to do what they're supposed to be doing. What we see in terms of the federal changes is that the carrots that incentivize districts and schools to advance equity for English learners are in jeopardy, and the sticks to enforce compliance are weakened. Nonetheless, the legal obligations still exist.
Thank you. And Montserrat, can you talk to people about what that means? What did you do in your office during the Biden administration that is not happening now in the Trump administration? And talk to us kind of more concretely about the consequences of this change in administration and policy. Montserrat is a little frozen. We're going to see if she comes back. Ileana, maybe you can jump in and talk for reporters who haven't done much coverage of English learners. Can you offer a picture of this population and kind of frame for us the diversity within it? And I see Montserrat, you're back, but let's have Ileana talk about like the English learner population, and then we'll come to you.
Sure. All right. So a reminder for folks, right? We're talking about the English learner population. We're talking about a little bit more than 10% of the total students enrolled in U.S. public schools across the country. It's a particular population of students that is growing almost every year and in all parts of the country, right? So it's not just a growth that we're seeing in California, Texas, New York, and Florida. We're seeing English learner populations growing in rural Ohio, in Tennessee, in Louisiana. So this is a coverage area that I think every education reporter should, at least at some point, really get familiar with the English learner students in the school districts and states that they're covering, right? This is a very diverse population, not just in terms of cultural and ethnic makeup, multiple languages. There are English learner students for whom English is actually their third language, not their second language. And when we're thinking about the backgrounds of these students in terms of their academic background and how schools can support them, we're talking a huge variety, right? Most English learners are actually US born citizens. So they enroll in kindergarten. They tell, in enrollment, parents share that they speak a different language at home, test the child, and if it turns out that the student needs some language support, right, their English proficiency isn't all the way up there as you would want it to be, they get those language supports classified as an English learner. But you also have newcomer students. Often these are immigrant students that have been in the US for like 3 or fewer years in the country. That can also mean students who arrive in high school in need of enrollment, language, and academic support with a much shorter window, right, of time to be able to graduate on time for these students. We have long-term English learners. So these are students who have been receiving language services for about 6 or more years, right? So they might have started out in elementary school. They're testing and testing and testing their proficiency, and they're not testing out of that status. So these are students that have additional unique needs, right? That teachers are trying to figure out, how do we get you out of needing these language services and still sort of meeting grade level content and standards, right? And you also, like, it's important to note when English learners do test out, right? So they're now no longer known as English learners, you could say non-ELs, right? So much research has found that these students tend to outperform peers who have never received language services throughout their K-12 education, right? So when we're thinking about this population of students that we're talking about today, again, diverse population, diverse needs, right? Because an English learner that enters into services in kindergarten and no longer needs them by third grade is going to be very different support than a student that has not exited out while in middle school and a student that just arrived in 10th grade and you need to figure out how to get them up to speed, right? So Montserrat, I guess if you can lead us here to talking a little bit about how the federal government has been supporting this diverse population and what's changed.
Yes, thank you. Apologies, my internet. So first of all, the Office of English Language Acquisition had 16 people in staff. Right now, there's only one person leading the entire department, well, the entire Office of English Language Acquisition. So as you can imagine, that is detrimental for the services that we were doing when during the Biden administration. So first, we moved Title III back to OELA after 15 years from OESE, and we had expanded technical assistance from 2 people to actually having 6 people servicing the different teams, the 50 states providing technical assistance, monitoring, servicing states, literally answering questions that many of the states have, and we would have the teams reply all the time. No, that's no longer happening. We used to hold monthly webinars with the latest research-based practices for dual language, for syllabi literacy, early learning, and parent engagement. Those are no longer happening. For a while, the NCELA website was taken out. Now it's back, but again, no information is put in there currently. And I think the most detrimental.
1 second. Just some of these departments you're mentioning. INSELA is the National Clearinghouse. Montserrat, just explaining the term. So INCELA is the National Clearinghouse. This is about data and resources.
Correct.
Mhm.
Correct. Yes, and all the information that has been housed there has been extremely helpful for districts and states, and it's still there, but it hasn't been updated with any information. The most detrimental thing is the 107 national professional development grants that we had. That we're doing an outstanding job on professional development for educators, for communities. On September 25th, 28 of them receive non-continuation letters. And so this was very unexpected because in the first administration, those grants kept going and, they kept receiving the necessary funds. But all of a sudden they received these letters and they have been kept in the dark. They had 7 days to appeal, and the day before the shutdown, they were due, and many of them have not heard back from the Department of Education. So you have 28 from those 28 NPD grants, you have educators, teachers, university professors that are on how they don't know what to do. Some of them have already, unfortunately, dropped out of their courses because they're not able to pay for them. So it is very upsetting and detrimental, and it will have a lasting effect in our community for sure.
I hope reporters on the call are thinking about which people in the districts they cover they should be checking in with to see if any of these grants and funding streams are affecting them. Megan, can you talk about how states are stepping up to fill this federal void when it comes to English learner policy and just resources and leadership?
Absolutely. So I have a unique vantage point working with folks in the state departments of education from across the country. And then, of course, given the diminished federal infrastructure and uncertainty over funding that I described in my last response, it falls on states to really define what those policy carrots and sticks are. So how are they going to incentivize and how are they going to enforce upholding the civil rights of English learners during this time when the federal supports may not be doing so. And what I've seen across states, and I'll give some specific examples in a minute, it often requires finding windows of policy opportunity to change state policy, to shift education code or regulations. And this often happens kind of when constituents, advocacy organizations, state departments of education, et cetera, align around a pressing issue, for example, an increase in a population in a state, or when legislative sessions begin. So those are sort of ways that official policy might change, but also states can issue guidance and provide technical assistance to districts and schools. So what I observed in many states over the last year to 6 months to a year is that they would issue guidance to schools around this uncertainty and say, we've seen shifts at the federal level, but these are the rights that still need to be upheld. These are the aspects of programs that still need to be upheld, and that you need to have adequate staffing and resources, et cetera. And then, of course, what Montserrat just describes might affect staffing, et cetera. And so then states and districts need to figure out kind of how they're going to address those gaps. But I'll give a couple of examples of states that have passed explicit policies, again, sort of with supports from legal advocates and coalitions across the state. The governor in both Massachusetts and in Illinois signed bills protecting equal access to public education for immigrant students. Massachusetts, the law was called the Protect Educational Equity Bill. And it also not only preserves legal protections to education for immigrant students, but it also requires supports for English learners with special needs and students with special needs generally, and requires school interpreters to be trained and qualified so that all parents can participate in their children's education. So these are things that are required by federal law, but Massachusetts has codified them in their state law so that they can now require those in their schools and districts without having to rely on the federal policy. We've also seen in other states.
Sorry, Megan, can you mention why these states, what are these states trying to get ahead of by passing these laws? Like there are a couple threats to these core kind of protections.
Yeah, so we've seen bills being proposed in several states that would essentially do different things that would go against the Plyler v. Doe decision that grants access to public education to students who do not have documents. And those have looked at they've taken different forms in terms of collecting data on those students, which is not legal. They've also taken the form of charging those families tuition for their children to attend school. And in general has created a sense of fear in many immigrant communities. And so what Illinois and Massachusetts did was basically said, we're going to kind of remove that uncertainty for our communities, and we're going to codify in state law that the protection to students to have access to free public education, even if they're undocumented. And so that was because of the shifts and the waves of in the climate in the US, but also because other states had been putting forth legislation to try to do the opposite, which none have been successful thus far, but we don't know in the next legislative cycle if things will change. But also there was a shift with the executive order around English as the national language. Many districts and schools interpreted that as, oh, then I shouldn't be providing supports to parents in a language other than English, misreading the executive order, because the executive order does not, the executive order takes up the Civil Rights Act and critiques it under the disparate impact clause, which I don't need to get into, but it does not and cannot undo the Equal Educational Opportunity Act, which ensures the rights of language minorities and says you cannot discriminate based on language. So under the Equal Educational Opportunity Act, schools and districts still have the obligation to provide those services. And so Massachusetts then wanted to, again, put in law rather than just guidance that that is required, even if the federal government's executive order may have been interpreted in a different way. And then just a couple of other examples. Some states have passed new regulations for their English learner students that require a lot more or include a lot more specificity around instructional programs and requirements for teachers. And then some other states have also been working to revise and or have revised their funding formulas to include weights, to ensure that they include weights for English learners, meaning that schools with English learners will receive additional funding to ensure that they have adequate supports for students, so that funding will come from the state level versus having to rely solely on Title III funds to implement those. And so that happened. Michigan, for example, has a new policy around both a new weighted funding formula as well as new requirements for instructional time and teachers of English learners. So a lot of other states are looking to those states as examples of kind of what they can do perhaps in the next legislative cycle, or when revisions to their education code become part of the conversation.
Okay, great. And so then when it comes to funding streams, the Trump administration has proposed zeroing out Title III funding, which has historically supported English learners. There are professional development grants that are expected to disappear. Montserrat, can you talk about the consequences of losing this funding? And then what are your kind of recommendations for states and districts to potentially get creative to cover those gaps?
Yeah, I mean, losing the funding, it's going to have definitely detrimental consequences, especially in those states that are not supporting English learners. So, for instance, it can really reduce the instructional capacity and the services that students receive, right? So, for instance, the funding reductions can really lead to fewer ESL teachers, larger caseloads, reduced instructional time, and also the elimination of targeted services for newcomers and long-term ELs. It can also weaken really the professional development pipeline. So like I mentioned with the NPD grants, those grants will really help the will slow definitely the licensure for pathways. It will reduce the grow your own programs, and it will limit training in evidence-based EL instruction for many teachers. It can also, I think schools that are in numbers of multilingual learners, they will often serve students experiencing poverty, right? So maybe they need to relocate these general funds to meet the legal obligations under the rights of law, civil rights law. So potentially reducing the number of resources for.
I think she'll be right back. Let's just give her a couple seconds because Ileana, if we want you to help reporters think about localizing the story. So Montserrat is giving a lot of ideas about what funding streams and what kind of programs you might see disappearing. Maybe you can jump in now and offer some advice to reporters.
Yeah, I think something to keep in mind as we're talking about whether or not Title III federal dollars that are often, specifically used for supplemental services, right? For English learners. So as Mozarat was talking about, it can pay for bilingual aids, for instance, in a classroom that is often a huge assistance to general education teachers that are still in the process of sort of learning the best practices for working with English learners. It can pay for after school programs that can really help language development for some of these students. One thing to note historically, my understanding from talking to advocates and districts and state leaders themselves is that Title III dollars have never actually kept up with the growth of the English learner population over time, right? So even if in a best case scenario, right, that there is no loss of the funding, but it's just literally the same dollar amount that just continues on into the next year, that's still not going to be enough to cover, the growth population. I'll hand it over to Montserrat in case there was any additional information you want to provide before I continue on. I just provided some context, Montserrat, on Title III dollars have never really been enough to actually keep up with the growth of students.
Yes, for sure. Thank you. And apologies, my internet is just not working with me today. So yeah, I mean, I think that the long term and the academic impact, economic impact that this is going to have in terms of research, for instance, right? Because not having these monies going to the States, it's really going to impact and reduce really the investment, many workforce readiness, taxes. Again, a lot of concerns, but I think some ways that the districts and the states can help address the gaps. It's all about intentional collaboration, and it's really, for instance, braiding and blending the funding streams, which is essentials. Some districts align Title I and IDA and state compensatory education and local funds to really support EL instruction, particularly when that the students overlap with that. That can be done. State level policy responses, many states may increase the state funding formulas for multilingual learners, expanding that state fund licensures for pathways, investing statewide in PDE systems to offset those federal reductions. Also, I've seen and actually heard about the regional and the consortium models. So where districts sometimes pull resources through regional services centers and they share professional development offerings and they join licensure cohorts to reduce the cost. It's a great example. Also, the Grow Your Own and internal capacity building. There are some great places that are doing Grow Your Own programs like New Jersey with high schools and the colleges there, and they're really investing on that. And that's, again, at the state level, also held by AFT, one of the unions. They're really bringing everybody to the table and they're thinking outside the box on how to make sure to provide the best resources for the students. And then also like the partnerships with higher education and community organizations. So again, kind of like the model of the MPD, but universities, nonprofits, community-based organizations may really help provide training in terms of family engagement or supplemental services, sometimes really supported by philanthropy or state grants. And I think we underestimate the power of working with philanthropy. And once you get those connections at the state level and businesses, you can really make a case on them investing in the community. So I think more of that's definitely something that we can do.
Thank you. Ileana, do you have more ideas for reporters for localizing?
Yeah, I think definitely. So we're still sort of trying to figure out exactly what the education budget will look like, right, moving forward into this year. Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody on this call, if I haven't missed a new update somehow. But I think if you don't already know what your local districts that you cover or what your state has funded with Title III in this past school year and in years prior, I think it's good to already start making that list, right? Whether that is staffing, whether that is instructionals, like supplemental instructional materials, like keep a tab of where Title III are actually going right now in the school districts that you cover, because then if something were to happen to that total dollar amount for Title III, you're already going to have a better idea, right, of what could be lost and what school districts are going to be doing to figure out how to supplement that. If it's working with philanthropic groups or community partners to offer somebody to watch kids for after school programs because they can't pay somebody for that anymore because that's what they were using those dollars for. Speak to folks at the state SEAs, right, your education agencies. Whoever sort of runs Title I will often also be involved with sort of Title III budget, and try to get a sense of what the Title III budget for your specific state has looked like over time. And do they feel that it's been enough for their specific state? Because a reminder, some states do have much bigger English learner populations than others. There are some, like Alabama, that the population growth has only been happening in the last 10 years. So how has that state, for instance, been making sure that they are receiving enough federal dollars, and what would it look like if that were to suddenly shrink or disappear, right? So there's a lot of sort of pre-work that you can already do of sort of assessing how this money is going. As we've kind of mentioned earlier, if the local school district that you cover were actually involved in one of those national professional development grant programs, or they were partnering with universities, this is both if that grant got eliminated or if that grant is continuing. You might want to check in to see how that work is going and sort of what's at stake moving forward, right? Because we still don't know what's going to be the fate of that program overall in the years to come, right? I think from there, it's just sort of assessing how those dollars are going, how creative, as we've already heard, sort of examples, right, at the state level and local district level of how creative places can get to fund the academic success of English learners. Start checking in on that. And you'll find that there are a lot of interesting stories too, in terms of creative ways that school districts have been using Title III, using grant funding to create sort of innovative programs in your classrooms or highlight the gaps that still remain.
Great. Megan, one reason the Trump administration has given for zeroing out the Title III funding is that it's been used for bilingual education. Oh no. Can you talk about why this doesn't make sense?
Sure. Well, first, it's important to note that federal education policy has not mentioned bilingual education since the passage of No Child Left Behind in 2002, where the federal law, bilingual education, any references to it were taken out of the policy, and the Office for English Language Acquisition was renamed as such, rather than including the term bilingual. So the law in itself does not actually explicitly or implicitly support bilingual education. And as Montserrat was talking about, Title III can be used for a variety of purposes, not just bilingual education, but staffing, professional learning, resources, family engagement, et cetera. And the vast majority of programs for English learners are actually not bilingual education programs. And in fact, we may see that English dominant kids benefit or tend to benefit in many places more, tend to have the most benefit of dual language and bilingual education programs in many communities compared to their English learner student populations. Nonetheless, we know from decades of research now that bilingual educational models are the most effective for promoting long-term academic outcomes for all students. So that means that they are beneficial for all students, but actually necessary for English learners because they promote the best long-term academic outcomes as well as English language proficiency over time. So really, if the federal government wants to support English language proficiency and the speaking of English of all of its population, then actually bilingual education would be the best mechanism for doing so. Notwithstanding the additional benefits of being bilingual for not just students learning English, but all students, cognitive benefits, social benefits, and has been mentioned, the economic benefits of being bilingual. So for a variety of reasons, both related to English learners specifically and the general population, doing away with this funding because it's been used for bilingual education really does not make sense.
So I mentioned I'm working on a book about bilingual education. Just fun factoid from the 1970s, all of the federal policy, court cases, and department policy mentioned that ESLs, or English only education for students who are coming into school not speaking English, was developmentally inappropriate at the elementary level. So bilingual education was said from since the 70s the only right way to actually teach these students, and here we are with an administration that doesn't want to see it at all. So, Montserrat, you have a union background and have been an advocate for mobilizing in the face of this administration. How are educators and advocates organizing opposition, and what might reporters look for in their own coverage areas?
Yes, thank you. So I believe intentional collaboration is a key. And I think that, as I am the advocacy chair for the National Association for Bilingual Education, and we have been very intentional on thinking outside the box on how do we organize and mobilize. So we are collaborating with other stakeholders, organizing at the national, state, and district level, and doing webinars on how to advocate for English learners and multilingualism by providing toolkits on how do you connect with your legislators, how do you really amplify your voice. And coming from a union background, I think it's really important for reporters to connect with their unions in their communities to see how they are really advocating, right? Also, I want to highlight something that we did back in June. We held a virtual national press conference highlighting 4 states and how when they were halting the Title III funds, and how it was impacting communities. And we were very intentional in highlighting educators, in highlighting superintendents, bilingual coordinators, and really sharing those stories. And we highlighted in English learners and the impact of that. And so, weeks later, we had about 15 articles out of that national press conference actually sharing stories about English learners and the impact of that. And I felt that that was very intentional, but it was very powerful because, weeks later, we had 5 Republicans that actually wrote a letter to the White House asking for those funds to be released. So talk about the power of organizing and mobilizing, right? So I think we should really never underestimate the power of our stories and our ability to really advocate. But we also have we need to embrace the fact that we're going to have in different communities people that are very loud and can, jump in a Zoom and share their stories. But we can also have people that work at the district level in the schools that can be very quiet, but also very thoughtful on their way that they advocate. And right now we need all of that, right? And I really think that for the reporters that are listening, building relationships with the community, with the organizations, with the immigration community organizations that are in your communities is essential, because you will get those stories that really touch people. But I think it's important that, yes, all the national organizations are great and they're very powerful, but they have very deep connections with the community. So reaching out to them and building those, it's essential.
Mm-hmm. Just a reminder to the audience, we're going to shift to Q&A in about 10 minutes. If you have questions that you want to get in, drop them into the Q&A box, and make sure to include your affiliation, your name and affiliation. And I will try and pronounce your names properly as I read those questions out in a little bit. In the meantime, Megan, so we know only a portion of English learners are undocumented or have parents who are undocumented. We also know that this is a population that is particularly affected by Trump's immigration crackdown. Can you talk about what reporters should be keeping in mind when covering this and looking at the effect on schools?
Sure. Yeah. And just thinking about first what I've seen in the media that may actually be harmful in its rhetoric. So there have been some reports put out that attempt to quantify the cost of educating undocumented students. And in some of those reports, they equate the English learner population to the undocumented student population, which makes it look like the cost of educating undocumented students is much higher than it actually is, because there's only about a I think there's less than 30% overlap in those populations, where only about 30% of undocumented students are actually English learners. So there are some misconceptions about those populations and the extent to which they're synonymous or not. And correcting that, I think, is important. But in terms of kind of keeping in mind what this population may be going through and experiencing, whether they're students or undocumented themselves or have family members who are, is that I suppose fairly obviously there's a general sense of fear in many of these communities, but that has emotional and behavioral effects that kids bring into school, not just undocumented students, not just English learners, but researchers show that that affects all kids. So when there's heightened ICE raids in a community, that is felt in schools in terms of school safety and school climate, absenteeism, long-term academic outcomes, not just for those students directly affected by it, but for all students in that community, and particularly students of color and marginalized populations, but also increasingly white students as well. So there's also, I guess, one of the biggest impacts is school absenteeism, which could also then indirectly or directly affect school funding. If there's if school funding, if attendance rates for school funding are taken at a time when there are significant ICE raids occurring in a community, those rates are then going to be much lower than the school actually serves. And so that may then impact the funding that they receive. And then again, not even directly related to absenteeism, but related to sort of the sense of fear and climate, the negative effects on the climate, is that we've seen short and long-term effects on students' standardized test rates and even their post-secondary attainment when there have been large-scale ICE raids in a community. So this has, these two activities, I guess, education and immigration enforcement are directly intertwined, I think, in ways that many of us don't often think about. But they really have, the sociopolitical context really does have a direct impact on communities, and it is important to highlight that impact, with the caveat that obviously, as a reporter talking on, if you were to speak to undocumented families, I'm not sure how many would be open to talking to reporters at this time either. So it's also having to be sensitive and careful about who you speak to and the questions that you ask. And as Montserrat said, perhaps connecting with immigrant advocacy organizations first, school district officials and teachers first, to really understand what's happening before actually directly speaking to those community members or attempting to speak to those community members, because we wouldn't want to elevate that sense of fear in any communities.
Mm-hmm. We're going to go around to all of you, but starting with Ileana, can you talk about what organizations or data sets that reporters should know about or know that they can request when reporting on English learners?
I wanted to give sort of a shout out to something that Montserrat had mentioned earlier. As she said, the website has not been updated with sort of new posts and new information, but there is historical sort of statistics and data on the English learner population, biennial reports to Congress, sort of detailing more information about this diverse population at a national level. And that's the NCELA, NCELA.ed.gov site, the National Clearinghouse for English Language Acquisition. When that's going to be updated is still a question. But there is some historical information there that if you, as a primer, right, would recommend it. There are multiple different organizations if you want sort of additional figures on the reality of students who may be undocumented or at least have one undocumented family member or are just immigrant students and newcomers. The Migration Policy Institute does have a lot of great, statistics and data sets that you can use. We also have, if you want, as folks have been talking about, reaching out to more community organizations first before you start immediately going to families who might be a little too anxious right now for interviews. You have the Internationals Network for Public Schools. You have the National Newcomer Network. You have research, in terms of understanding the research landscape and why, what Megan was saying earlier, why bilingual education is actually a really good, if not the best, approach to education for these students. You have the American Institutes for Research. You have New America. You have, as Montserrat has mentioned, National Association for Bilingual Education. A lot of these groups are also part of the National English Learner Roundtable that has also been advocating on behalf of these students at the national level, talking to policymakers. All these groups can again connect you to state leaders or to individual districts that they've sort of highlighted this whole time. Obviously reaching out if you haven't already to your school district, either your multilingual director, your ELD, English Language Development Director, your English Learner Director, who can better put you in touch with families and the educators who are working much more, predominantly with these students. If there are any newcomer academies in the districts that you cover, right, reaching out to them if you want to get some more perspective from those populations of families. Reviewing, on the topic of the intersection of immigration and education, reviewing whether or not the districts that you cover have any protocols in place regarding what to do if immigration enforcement officers arrive and want access to a school building or information about a student or families. See if your districts have some kind of protocol in place for their front desk folks to what to do in that scenario, and kind of review it. If they have it, how extensive is it? Is everybody in the district and the school buildings trained on it or not? Why or why not? If they don't have a protocol, why don't they have a protocol, right? Those are some questions to be asking at the local level, but as well as some of these national organizations, as Monserrat pointed out. A lot of research has been conducted by these groups. Colorín Colorado is another one that stands out, especially if you want like a very good primer to just understanding a lot of the terminology in the world of English learners and multilingual students, and a lot of great videos explaining different instructional practices that you might come across in your reporting.
Great. Did she miss anything? Megan, Montserrat, what can you add?
I'll jump in because it looks
some
like
of the
no.
organization. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Organizations. The 30 national organizations from the EL Roundtable is TESOL, CAL, IDRA, the Century Foundations. AFT and NEA have been great. The resources in terms of immigration, as Ileana was saying, they're outstanding. And I do want to plug in the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, the Legal Defense Fund, and the Asian Americans Advising Justice just put a wonderful multiple set of resources that I will put the links on. And recently this week, Forward USA put a powerful tool report about the power of plier versus doe. I definitely, you should check it out because it is a lot of great information, a lot of great reports. And, as a teacher, I always say sharing is caring. And this is exactly what we need to do right now. Share it as much information because you don't really need to reinvent the information already, and utilize.
And we'll try and get some of these links into the chat. So we'll work on getting those through. Megan, are there more that you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on Montserrat's discussion, sort of the legal landscape. The National Immigration Law Center, or NILC, has been squarely focused on trying to support and develop a media campaign around the importance of educating undocumented students and all immigrant students. And so they may be a good resource. They have a website dedicated to that campaign. I would also mention that, if you're interested in connecting with folks in state departments of education, the Council of Chief State School Officers is the largest professional association for both state chiefs as well as State Department of Education staff. They have an English learner collaborative that I happen to advise and includes members from about 40 states. There's also the National Association for English Learner Program Administrators, NIELPA, which is similar to CCSSO, but includes state and local EL-focused leaders and staff members. And so if, say, you're not sure who to contact in your state or local districts, NIELPA might be a good first stop to say, I'm interested in learning more about XYZ, and they may be able to help you connect you with constituents in your state or area, or more broadly. Those those would be the three kind of organizations that I would mention. I would also say, like Ilana, the last thing I'll say is Ileana mentioned the Migration Policy Institute. They do a lot of work with advocates and community organizers as well. So there wouldn't just be a resource. They would be a great resource for information and research. They may also be a good resource for talking to about sort of what's happening in communities and at the local level that may or may not actually be currently published.
I'll just add, so from an investigative reporter here, thinking about what data you can request from your own districts. English Learner, there's a ton of data in schools, as we know. A lot of it is reported in state report cards. So you should be able to look up your district through the state. And the district is sending tons of information every year to the state in order to then report it to the federal government. So even if the federal government stops reporting, you should still be able to request it at the state level or just directly from your local district. And I know we talked about this in preparing for this panel. Ileana had mentioned, you can request attendance, average daily attendance, or you can get attendance data to really put real numbers in your community about what potential kind of ICE raids and that environment of fear is doing to student attendance. And so think about what you might be able to just request directly. I always like to tell people they should not be afraid of FOIAing. It is not aggressive. It is not rude. You shouldn't resort to a FOIA after you can't get the information yourself. Just put out some FOIAs as fishing expeditions and see what comes back and see what kind of numbers that can add to your stories. So we've got a couple questions in the Q&A here. LaShawn Pagan with Charlottesville Tomorrow is describing that, it's hard to establish relationships with the immigrant community in Charlottesville where she reports. But yeah, where that reporting is happening, perhaps the reporter has the attention of the community, but not necessarily the sources directly. And so what are suggestions to break through that wall and be able to share the community stories? We talked a bit about this, but if anybody else has more advice, chime in.
So I would recommend people to go to churches and congregations. Immigrant communities are a lot of them do go to church and have great relationships with their pastors. So reaching out to them, and that pastor can be maybe the liaison between the reporter and some community. And I think, again, building those relationships from the beginning is essential. And attending events, community. It's how once people start to see you, then they kind of start reading your articles and things like that. But I think when capturing someone's story, just honoring them and treating them with dignity and respect, it's important, and building a relationship with them.
If I may add, just a lot of families do trust their teachers, especially the teachers that work with English learners. So if you are already sort of making your connections as an education reporter with the teachers that are working with English learners, that is another great way because you have a sort of a vetted introduction to families that you want to speak to, the family community engagement officers, if the district has invested. Note that I said if the district has invested in family and community engagement, where those personnel are really regularly in communication with families, they can help make those introductions for you.
We have one question. Denise Marie Ordway, managing editor of the Journalist's Resource, mentioned in Florida, there are students, she knows in her family and in her neighborhood, students were put into ESL classes who don't speak a language other than English and didn't decline services because the parents liked the small class sizes. Any ideas about how common it might be to have this kind of mistaken classification and what the kind of implications of that are?
My understanding from covering some of this, especially, I think Megan sort of touched on it earlier, and I apologize for not sort of emphasizing this at the very beginning when I was talking about the diverse backgrounds and circumstances of English learners. There have been issues of, for instance, students being misidentified as needing language services when really they needed special education support, or vice versa. They think that a student is so silent that perhaps they have a disability that doesn't allow them to communicate verbally. It turns out they just really don't want to speak in a language that they don't understand. And so that was an error in identification. Right? So unfortunately, that happens. And Megan and Monserrat, you can speak a little bit more as to it is an issue, right, in terms of misidentification of students. There's also an issue, as I wanted to mention earlier, when I talked about newcomer and immigrant students, not all of those students have interrupted or limited formal education in their home countries. There's also been the incorrect identification of immigrant students being placed in what you would say a remedial course when they've already taken all of that grade level content in their home country. So unfortunately that happens. It shouldn't. But it does. And I think it is something that's worth sort of covering and investigating as to how well schools are actually identifying students in need of support. And I wanted to have one note: when you're requesting data of sort of the current landscape of English learners in your school, don't just remember that English learners are taking state standardized tests, but they're also taking language proficiency assessments. In a lot of states, that is the WIDA access test. Other states like California and Texas have their own. But that is data that should be collected as well, that you should also be monitoring, because for English learners, you want to make sure that they are meeting grade level standards, but you're also making sure that their language proficiency is improving.
And I'll just add, the key to, I think, understanding whether or not there's identification or misidentification is understanding what your state's home language survey is and how it is implemented in districts and schools. So the federal government requires that all states use a home language survey that's supposed to be applied in the same way across the states, to have an identification process that's the same across the state. So the state will put out questions on a home language survey. They vary, however, in terms of, do your child speak a language other than English at home? Do they speak a language other than English most of the time? There are various questions about the child's language use as well as the family's language use. And so there may have been a question that said a child speaks a language other than English at home, but actually is fluent in English, right? And so that might have been where the misunderstanding occurred. That student was then identified to take a screener to see how proficient they are testing in English. And then if they test below a certain level on the English of that screener, then they are placed in English learner services, of course, with the approval of their parents. So there are several steps in the process that should theoretically catch misidentification in either way, whether a student is not identified and should be, or is identified and shouldn't be. Some states are also putting in place ways to sort of unidentify a student in those instances of misidentification, and really trying to think about that. So if you are going to investigate that, I would actually start with what happens when a student is enrolled in school, right? What's the paperwork that they fill out, and what is that process like? And is the district and is the school implementing in the way that it is supposed to be implemented?
Yes, to all of that. And I think, one of the resources that we developed under Encela Anuela was the EL Family Toolkit. So the English Learner Family Toolkit, it consists of 6 chapters, and in each chapter it contains 5 sections, but it gives you the overview, the family and students' rights, the questions parents can ask, tips, and a bunch of different resources. And we actually, it's available in English, Arabic, Chinese, and Spanish. And we created these one-page tip sheets, both in English and Spanish, that are very helpful. And I think providing this to parent specialists and to community members is essential, because it's literally a cheat sheet of what parents can ask administrators, but also how they can advocate best for their kids. And we actually had a whole thing with the Mexican consulate, where we trained the Mexican consulates on these, and they were extremely helpful. There's thankfully still in the NCLA website, and it's something that I think we released it the last year, and we were really trying to share it with the community.
Great. We're in our final minutes here. We have a question from Claude Goldenberg, an education professor at Stanford. What's the place of literacy instruction in this discussion, whether English learners are in an English only or a bilingual environment? Literacy achievement is the single biggest obstacle to reclassification as being fully English proficient. Any thoughts on what should be done about this? Megan.
Hi, Claude. Sure. Hi, Claude. Thanks for being here. I would urge a reframe of that um, suggestion that poor literacy achievement is the single biggest obstacle. I would say poor opportunities to effective literacy instruction may be the bigger obstacle. And so, therefore, thinking about teacher preparation, thinking about designing school systems that integrate both, um, that integrate evidence-based literacy instruction. We know that there's some debate in the field about that right now, and the best ways to teach literacy to all kids, especially and considering English learners. I don't want to necessarily get into that debate right now or what the evidence base is, but Claude, I know you're very familiar with the evidence base around effective literacy instruction for emergent bilingual students and multilingual students. And thinking about how do we actually implement that in schools is a systemic question, not a student level question, and really is incumbent on our leadership, policy, as well as teacher preparation to really think about how to move the needle, not just in literacy, but overall the instruction of English learners who tend to be marginalized in all aspects of education in the country.
And on this point, just for the reporters, if you are in states that passed in the last few years science of reading bills, it is worth checking in with your English learner advocates and school districts and hearing how those laws are being implemented with the needs of English learners in mind, and whether there are any concerns about whether the laws are hurting kind of best practices for English learners or helping shape improvement and growth among this population. So another reporting idea. We did talk a little bit, someone mentioned some mistakes in coverage. Any other ideas, anything that you think reporters should be keeping in mind as they're reporting on this so they're not making the same mistakes others have, or whether it's notes on terminology or framing for stories? Last couple minutes, people can jump in.
I would say it's less of a concern of mistakes, although one big one, as Megan pointed out, to not automatically conflate immigrant students with English learners, right? That is a big one that even some schools and districts don't necessarily get right sometimes. So as reporters, just be mindful and clear of that distinction. But more so, just I encourage way more education reporters to be covering their English learner, student populations, families, and teachers, because there are so many great stories out there. One thing that I think we had sort of discussed in the planning for this, the fact that there are a lot of educators who are on DACA, right? That's another way of the intersection of immigration and education, that if you are covering districts with those educators, what's going on with their future and what's happening with that legislation, right? Sort of tension of its fate. So there are just a lot of unique sort of human interest, true, like, tried and true education policy and instructional stories that can be done, budget stories that can be done, to Megan's point of how states are investing or not in the student population. My one caveat there is just have fun with it, because there's so many great stories out there from these families and educators. And especially right now with what's going on with so many shifts in terms of priorities at the federal level, it's even more important to keep an eye out on how well these students and families are being served, and where's there room to grow, so that we know what's going to happen down the line. So we're ready for anything that might happen.
I would just simply recommend highlighting the amazing stories of English learner students and families, their linguistic giftedness, their cultural assets and resources that they bring, and really framing the conversation around their contributions, rather than kind of thinking about these families and communities from a deficit perspective.
Should we let Montserrat, last final piece of advice for reporters?
I mean, I think you all said it all. Very grateful for every reporter that has really done their job in representing our communities with dignity and respect. We need those stories more than ever, and just a big appreciation to all. Thanks.
Thank you.
That is a great place for us to wrap up. So thank you to our panelists for a fantastic conversation, and thank you to Tara for moderating. And we really appreciate all of you who have taken time to participate in today's webinar. I dropped a link in the chat to an evaluation form. We'll also send that to you by email, but if you would please take a moment to fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. We take our member feedback very seriously and use it to improve our offerings. So again, thank you all so much and have a good rest of your day.